Howdy peeps, hope everyone's doing well. So obviously I've been covering a bit about the whole cluster bees recently. You know, reminding myself and all you other people out there of the roots that you've probably come from as well. Not necessarily within your own family, but probably something you have experienced in life as you've trodden your path, as it were. Now, one of the things I do kind of enjoy doing, just as a side hobby when I ain't got much else going on, I've got a few minutes spare, other than making the odd video for here, of course, is going through quotes that people come out with and analysing and thinking about it and talking about it. So I've got a couple of quotes here, and I'm going to start off with this first one. And it's this video is more to do with codependency, which I'll be going into in a bit. And that's by codependency, I mean codependency within relationships, and the possible potential associated red flags that come with it. So the first quote is, I was told I was dangerous. I asked why. They said, because you don't need anyone. That's when I smiled. And that is a very powerful statement, really. You know, the not needing anyone. And this is something that I've found myself saying to people in the past. Usually when shit's about to hit the fan, it's just sort of like, well, you know, whatever. You weren't by my side before, and if you don't want to be by my side now, then that's fine. You know, it is literally to do with having the power to walk away from a shit situation, whether it's a friendship or a job or even a romantic relationship. So that, needless to say, comes from a perspective of a non-codependent. But I would argue that sometimes in relationships, codependency does kind of creep in on people, as does complacency, but I'll go into them in a minute. This other quote that I really like, which I find it quite interesting, it's quite passive-aggressive in my opinion, but the quote is, you don't need someone to complete you. You only need someone to accept you completely. Yeah, of course. Warts and all, as the saying goes. But you see, realistically, when you look at the type of people that say that sort of a thing, a lot of the time they have an underlying issue of their own. Sometimes it can be a form of insecurity, usually represented in an outwardly fashion as anger. You know, so they're, well, exactly that, passive-aggressive. A lot of the time they're passive until their neediness kicks in, as it were, and then they become aggressive. But of course you've got to accept them completely. A little bit ironic. Now, to a lot of people this should be a red flag, if I'm honest, because it's not what they're not telling you, it's just that they're not telling you. And it's sort of amazing, really, the way people tell you about themselves without even so much as saying too many words. Now, sure, a lot of guys will be like, well, you're reading quotes that women would normally say, and yeah, but it's also relevant to guys as well. You see, that other quote, I was told I was dangerous, I asked why. They said, because you don't need anyone. That's when I smiled. Now, that is a typical trait of a very healthy individual. Well, you could argue that there's a level of passive aggressiveness in that if you really wanted to, but I guess it suits my narrative right now to not be the case, because it is, you could argue it could be seen as quite a narcissistic quote in itself. You know, as in they know they don't need anyone, and they know they can have people that will fall for their charms in their life quite easily. We do often sort of, I'll say we, guys in the manosphere, Migto in particular, do actually go around saying that, 30% of women are on head meds. That leaves 70% running around undiagnosed. Yeah, there's a possibility for that. There is a possibility for that. So anyway, on to the whole codependency thing and how it can creep in within relationships. And a lot of you guys will probably thinking, why is this even, or why am I talking about it? So, it's because it's quite relative. I've often sort of said I want the best for anyone that comes to the channel, regardless of whether they are choosing to not enter into romantic relationships, partnerships, whatever, or whether they do want to. Because a lot of the time there's been plenty of red flags that we've all chosen to ignore for one reason or another, usually because we've got them love goggles on or rose-tinted glasses. And sort of like I said before, if you listen to what people say, they're actually telling you who they are and what they're about. It's how you choose to interpret it. But again, that can come with its own set of problems. In particular, if you have been involved in a toxic relationship in the past, it means that you're more likely to be ultra sensitive to the issues. And sometimes they can be non-issues, but your ultra sensitivity does get the better of you. And again, I'm not saying that you're being too sensitive. If it's a gut feeling, then you should probably go with it, in all fairness. So, one of the topics that I've covered has been codependency and the narcissist. And it's actually they're both quite evolving roles in a lot of situations, in a lot of relationships. And whereas it does literally become a power struggle. You can have one person being the codependent, who will often be needy for whatever reason. Maybe it's they need a constant show and affection of love, whether it's physical, verbal, sexual, whatever. And at the same time, I would say it depends on the person. And I'd also say that a lot of the time, if you start failing to meet them needs, then there's a high chance that they will look elsewhere to get the needs to be met. Whatever it is, whether it's just communication, or if it's physical and sexual desires that they are lacking by their own standards. But that's kind of not really even scratching the surface, really. I mean, a lot of needy people are needy for a reason. A lot of the time it can be traced back to sort of childhood. Maybe they had a birth of a sibling, and they therefore felt less loved at the birth of that sibling, and so therefore had to, or felt the need. And again, this comes from a place of ego, where it feels the need to put itself on display a bit more, in whichever way. Now, in the terms of a guy, there's a potential that they may become more aggressive. They may potentially end up going down a dark road of potential criminal, even if short-term criminal empire, or at least criminal activities, whether it's just something basic like drug abuse. And again, this is something that a lot of people don't really always fully understand. Sometimes drug abuse itself, not that I'm justifying it, but it does come from a place of needing to be numb to the feelings that they're going through, or a feeling to be numb to the situation in the outside world, because, the outside world, especially in 2020, is a bit of a shit show, but that's another different topic. But nonetheless, in that instance, the drug addict is obviously codependent on whatever it is their drug of choice. whether it's a soft drug or hard drug is pretty much irrelevant. It's still a codependency. Now, initially, it won't necessarily start out as a physical addiction. It'll be more of a mental addiction, something that can be overcome. And I would argue the same is possible for people that have their own codependency, their own neediness in relationships. Again, it's whether they're willing to do the work on themselves. But the problems often arise, and this is something that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about after watching another video on YouTube. It's by Fester, actually. I'll throw a link in the description for you guys to go ahead and watch it. But yeah, you got to, like, seriously, because this is sort of a situation that I've found myself in as well, and I sort of thought, am I codependent? I didn't think I was, you know. A lot of people do sort of come away from these situations thinking that, especially if they've gotten in with someone that's toxic. And you could argue for the whole thing of, oh, well, you know, you're trying to fix someone or something like that. And it's like, well, no, I know, you know, I've always known that you can't fix people. You can enter their lives and try and make their life a little bit easier. There's that. But fixing them, you can't do that. That would be too easy. You know, all it would take was like for a bunch of guys to get involved with the right people and just go ahead and fix them, and they could all go on their merry way or live happily ever after, whichever suits. But you see, one of the things that can tend to happen from both narcissistic people and codependent people is their reaction to situations. And then there's the empaths as well. Now, I consider myself to be an empath, which obviously, yeah, my opinion of myself is probably going to be somewhat biased, of course. And it comes from a place of, when I do enter in relationships with people, not necessarily just romantic relationships, but with relationships with people, is because I want them to be better people than who they are. And a lot of the time it does take work, and a lot of the time people are set in their ways, and you know, there's no telling them, you know, if they just reacted differently to a situation rather than doing the same thing that they've always done, then they may find themselves in a better place, you know, spiritually more than anything. But like I say, a lot of people haven't got it in them. I don't know that they're not willing to change. I think it's just that the sort of default setting is easier to fall back on. And so as a result of that, they just kind of, when things start getting a little bit hot and heavy, they just revert straight back to default. And then it's obviously personal choice as to whether they want to do the work on themselves. And a lot of people don't want to do the work on themselves, you know, and it does come from a place of ego as well. I mean, why recognise that there's something wrong with you when it's easy to point the finger at everyone else, right? So it is an interesting set of circumstances. And then I sort of thought to myself, well, what about when you get the potential for someone who is empathetic to others and sympathetic to others and wants, you know, it goes into relationships with, you know, well, what relationships are about, you know, trying to uplift the people in your life and help them become a better person for tomorrow. Now, of course, in doing so, sometimes it means a level of criticism. Of course, if we're talking about people with, well, codependency, which they're going to also have a tendency for narcissistic behaviour in one way or another. It's not that I'm referring to them as being the narcissist, although they kind of are at the same time because of how their ego reacts to situations, you know. I've sort of said this to people before. You know, you try criticising someone with narcissistic tendencies and see what happens. Try and have a rational discussion with them after that. See how it goes. A lot of the time they're unable to do the introspection on themselves because Or maybe their ego won't let them. Maybe that's what it is. But either way, the reaction is usually quite hostile, to say the least. Or it can definitely escalate quickly. And then that leaves the other person with a problem. You see, now at this point, I'm kind of switching the roles from someone that was potentially having the appearance of being codependent to now having switched to being relatively narcissistic, which would theoretically leave the other person as being a codependent, theoretically, even if deep below that, well, not even that deep, just below that sort of label of being codependent, they're actually an empath. Well, you've got a couple of choices as to what you can do. If they're unwilling to meet you halfway and compromise and accept the responsibility for the part that they played, then needless to say that it's going to be an argument that just goes round in circles and nothing gets achieved. In worst case scenario, it will just end in name calling. But that's just it. It's not the name calling bit, it's just the fact that nothing gets achieved. They are literally unwilling to grow within themselves. Their ego is physically and literally not letting them acknowledge the part that they play. I mean, I get it. Who wants to be wrong in an argument? Sometimes you have to listen to people that are close to you, that do love you. If they're telling you something about yourself, it might not be coming from a place of literal malice. They're not malevolent. They're not trying to put the other person down in any way, shape or form. They're just trying to help them improve as a person. But like I say, someone with narcissistic tendencies, whether they originally appear to be the codependent or not, will react negatively a lot of the time. So what do you do with that? Well, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do. Sadly speaking, depending how well they've got their shit together. I'm talking about the narcissist, which oftentimes they don't have their shit together. This is why they can't really do relationships with people that they consider to be below them for whatever reason. Well, that's subjective as well. Some narcissistic people do just use others because they can. There's another reason behind it. It might be financial gain, or it might just be using them for sex or whatever. So it's kind of one of them. But either way, as far as the empath is concerned, the best thing they can do is leave, and then try and wait until the situation cools down and go back again and try. Needless to say, if you're being met with nothing but stonewall and gaslighting, then there's very little point in continuing on that path. It will just lead to great unhappiness, and nothing will actually be achieved, other than upsetting the other person, which, a lot of the time the damage is usually done by then anyway. But even as an empath, even coming away from situations where you had the best intentions for someone else, it does kind of leave an odd feeling. Oftentimes you'll be sort of thinking, if you've been in a scenario in the past, you sort of think of it, just attracted another narcissist or a codependent turned narcissist. And it is a whole bag of what the hell's going on here. And truth be told, no matter how much you love that other person, there's not a great deal you can do to help them if they're unwilling to help themselves. And like I say, it's down to their ego. So it's an interesting set of circumstances. It's an unfortunate set of circumstances, because a lot of the time, if you stay, well, they're not going to respect you, and they sure as hell aren't going to love you. And a lot of the time, the abuse will just get worse, whether it's just continuous verbal or whether it even progresses onto something physical. It's not going to it's not going to end well. Unless the other person can do something about themselves and is willing to do something about themselves. Now the problem with all this, and this is to do with relationships as well, is sometimes you might find yourself in a scenario where you're not sure if you're actually being shit tested by a girl, or by a guy for that matter. You know, there's another famous quote by Marilyn Monroe, I do believe. It says that if you can't handle me at my worst, then you don't deserve me at my best. Yeah, well, how about you get a hold of yourself and learn how to control yourself and not act all crazy? And then present yourself as your best and learn how to communicate with others instead of acting out. But, you know, famous people and narcissism almost goes hand in hand. And that seems to have made its way throughout our society. Hence, I've done so many videos on our narcissistic culture that we live in. But anyway, a lot of the time it does come down to the individual and how much work they're willing to put in on themselves to realise the thoughts that they have, to ask their friends. You know, I mean, if you look at your circle of friends and you look at them really objectively, how many of them would you argue, would you say, are sociopathic in one way or another? Now again, this is quite an open question, and obviously it's a rhetorical one. But you see, there's a little bit of, in my point of view anyway, I think there's a little bit of sociopath in every single human being. We have to have that. In the same way, there's also a level of narcissism within us as well. Again, it comes down to a survival trait in some aspects. But when you deliberately gaslight, stonewall, manipulate, use coercive control to inflict that malevolently, viciously on other people, then that's when there's a problem. That is literally when you have become a true narcissist rather than a codependent. But again, with the narcissist, you always have to remember they love playing that little game. They put on the facade, they psychologically, emotionally abuse, they gaslight, they bait and switch, and then they play the victim. You know, and it takes, you know, for the average person to look outside of what's going on, it's quite, you know, sometimes it's quite obvious, but sometimes what is out there obvious and in our face isn't quite in our face as we like it to be, because it is so in our face, so we don't see it. Anyhow, bit of a long one, talking about the video. Thoughts, comments and opinions, feel free to jot them down as always. I hope you found this useful in some way, shape or form. And until the next one, stay cool, stay free, and peace out.